Nearly 2 years of relentless conflict in Sudan have inflicted immense suffering and turned parts of the country into a hellscape. Some of the humanitarian dimensions of this crisis bear repeating. More than 12 million people displaced, including 3.4 million people who have fled across Sudan's borders. More than half of the country, 24.6 million people, experiencing acute hunger. A collapse of health services, millions of traumatized children cut off from formal education, relentless patterns of sexual violence. And in several parts of the country, the already catastrophic situation of civilians has also actually worsened since our last briefing to this council less than 1 month ago. Today, I will focus on the latest alarming developments in North Darfur, including the Zamzam displacement camp in Khartoum and in the south of the country. Mr. President, in North Darfur, 8 months after the Security Council adopted Resolution 2736, civilians remain under attack. Violence in and around the Zamzam displacement camp, estimated to be hosting hundreds of thousands of civilians, and where famine conditions have been confirmed, has further intensified. Satellite imagery confirms the use of heavy weaponry in and around Zamzam in recent weeks, and the destruction of the main market facilities within the camp. Terrified civilians, including humanitarian workers, were unable to leave the area when the fighting was most intense. Many were killed, including at least 2 humanitarian workers. On Monday, Médecins Sans Frontières, the main provider of health and nutrition services in Zamzam, announced that it has been forced to halt its operations in the camp due to the deteriorating security situation. The United Nations World Food Programme has also just confirmed suspension of voucher-based food assistance in the camp due to insecurity and the destruction of the market. Civilians also continue to be directly impacted by ongoing fierce fighting in parts of Khartoum. The United Nations Human Rights Office has verified reports of summary executions of civilians in areas that have changed hands. We remain deeply concerned about the very serious risks faced by local responders and community volunteers in Khartoum and elsewhere. In the south of the country, we are receiving reports of fighting spreading into new areas in North Kordofan and South Kordofan, posing yet more risks for civilians and further complicating movements of humanitarian personnel and supplies. We have also seen shocking reports of further atrocities in White Nile State, including a wave of attacks earlier this month, reported to have killed scores of civilians. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, we welcome the decision by the Sudanese authorities to extend the authorization of the use of the Adre crossing of humanitarian movements. Humanitarian partners, including Sudanese frontline workers, have also continued their efforts to increase support via cross-line routes. Last year, some 15.6 million Sudanese were reached with some form of humanitarian support across the country. But the reality remains that what is getting through is a fraction of what is required, with insecurity and active hostilities, persistent bureaucratic impediments, and broader interference continuing to undermine our efforts to reach people most in need. Mr. President, last week, Under-Secretary General Fletcher and the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, launched the 2025 response plans for Sudan and the region. Together, these plans require $6 billion to support close to 21 people in Sudan and up to 5 million others, primarily Sudanese refugees in neighboring countries. This is a staggering amount of money, larger than any United Nations coordinated appeal in the history of Sudan. But as USG Fletcher said last week, This is a humanitarian crisis that is unprecedented in its scale and its gravity. And it is a crisis that is increasingly crossing Sudan's borders. The international community, in particular members of the Council, must spare no effort to mitigate this. Mr. President, let me conclude with 3 asks. First, protection of civilians. We call on the Security Council and all member states with influence to take immediate action to ensure all actors comply with international humanitarian law and protect civilians and the infrastructure and services they so much rely on. Civilians in Zamzam camp in North Darfur and elsewhere must be protected, whether they choose to stay or voluntarily move to safer areas. Across the country, attacks directed against civilians and attacks causing disproportionate civilian harm must stop immediately. We urge the Council to take up the recommendations on protection of civilians issued by the Secretary General last October. Second, and equally important under international humanitarian law, access. We need real implementation of the repeated commitments to facilitate and enable unhindered, unfettered humanitarian access to civilians in need. Third, funding. As we have said, the scale of Sudan's needs is unprecedented and requires an equally unprecedented mobilization of international support, including flexible funding. We are grateful to the donors who have already announced financial commitments. We are grateful to the donors for the support they've given us thus far. Mr. President, the people of Sudan deserve better from their leaders and from the international community. We must also do much more to support the communities that have opened their doors to the millions of people who have had to flee, both within Sudan and neighboring countries. Now, more than ever, 2 years on, the people of Sudan need your attention. I thank you.